What would you do if a single woman could make entire armies retreat before they even saw her face? That question whispered through royal courts long before her name reached any official chronicle. They called her the Shadow Huntress, a figure wrapped in fear, rumor, and the kind of whispered dread reserved for plagues and curses. She did not inherit power. She crafted it from darkness, from trauma, from a world that expected women to kneel while men wrote history. And yet, somehow, she rewrote the script with a ferocity that stunned even those who ruled with iron crowns and armies of thousands. Most stories about her start with the raids, but the truth begins earlier, in a border village wiped out so completely that only one survivor walked away. A girl. A girl who vanished into the woods and returned years later wearing the markings of a forgotten sisterhood that Europe pretended no longer existed. Chroniclers call them forest witches, blood seers, night sentinels. But those names came centuries later, once scholars realized the pattern hidden in the ruins of burned outposts and mutilated invaders. The Huntress was not just fighting a war. She was resurrecting a method of warfare older than kings themselves. What terrified rulers most was not her brutality, but her precision. She never struck randomly. She waited, listened, mapped the land the way a falcon watches currents of air. And when she finally moved, the violence was so surgical, it looked almost supernatural. Survivors spoke of traps that appeared overnight, of shadows that moved where no soldiers stood, of a figure who emerged from the tree line with a bow carved from a species of yew long believed extinct. But it was what she did afterward that shattered the minds of hardened warriors. Her attacks weren't meant to kill quickly. They were meant to send a message, carved into bodies left for kings to interpret. European rulers feared her because she exposed a truth they refused to acknowledge. An empire is only powerful if people believe in its inevitability. She broke that illusion. Her presence alone could destabilize alliances. There were nights when smoke rose over frontier fortresses, and messengers arrived trembling, insisting they had glimpsed her silhouette at dusk. Armies hesitated. Nobles whispered. Kings questioned their own strategies. Because wherever she went, the dead did not simply die. They testified. And here is the twist that most chronicles omit. The Huntress didn't work alone. Evidence suggests she belonged to a covert network of women trained in espionage, poisoncraft, and psychological warfare long before those terms existed. These women operated beneath the surface of medieval politics, influencing outcomes that historians mistakenly attributed to luck or divine intervention. The Huntress was their blade, their warning, their embodiment of retribution. And once rulers realized this was not a lone avenger, but a system, a hidden structure woven into the edges of Europe, fear spread faster than her arrows ever could. You might be wondering whether such a woman truly existed, or whether the myth grew from fragments of unrelated events. That uncertainty is exactly why kings panicked. They were not fighting an army. They were fighting an idea, one sharpened by brutality and wrapped in secrecy. And this is where her story begins to draw you in, because once you understand the first message she carved into the memory of Europe, everything else that follows becomes disturbingly clear. Before we descend into the first massacre she engineered, tell me something. Have you ever felt that history hides the most important details on purpose? You already sense that what comes next will challenge everything you thought you understood about medieval power. If this opening already stirred questions in you or made you rethink how fear shaped entire kingdoms, leave a comment sharing what struck you the most. And before we continue deeper, make sure you like this video and check whether you are subscribed, because understanding this story fully matters more than you realize. Now hold that thought, because the next event in her legend begins with a discovery so brutal that even battle-scarred invaders refuse to speak of it aloud. The discovery that silenced seasoned warriors began with a patrol sent to investigate why an invading band had failed to return. They expected resistance, maybe a skirmish, perhaps signs of a retreat. What they found instead was a clearing wrapped in an unnatural stillness, the kind that makes even trained soldiers grip their weapons tighter. The bodies were arranged with chilling deliberation, positioned as if reenacting their own moment of terror. None bore simple wounds. Their expressions were frozen in a shock so profound that chroniclers later described it as the mark of a mind breaking before the flesh followed. At first, generals assumed it was the work of a large force, but the details argued otherwise. The cuts were too clean, the angles too precise, the timing too coordinated to be a chaotic clash. Tracks in the soil revealed something far more unsettling: a single set of footprints weaving between the corpses, moving calmly, almost methodically, as if the perpetrator faced no threat at all. The soldiers hesitated to report this, fearing accusations of cowardice, yet the evidence forced them to speak. And when the tale reached royal courts, kings dismissed it as exaggeration. Until it happened again. The second massacre was worse. Survivors from another invasion attempt stumbled back to their camp, trembling, incoherent. They spoke of traps hidden in places no human should have predicted, of movements in the tree line that did not follow the patterns of any known fighter, of an enemy who struck without sound, without hesitation, without leaving a trace except devastation. One man claimed the Huntress watched them for days, studying them like prey, waiting for the precise moment when fear outweighed discipline. Only then did she strike. His account was so vivid that later, historians debated whether he had witnessed a woman or an apparition crafted by trauma. But what truly unsettled military strategists were the symbols carved into the trees surrounding the battlefield. They appeared ancient, far older than the local cultures, hinting at rituals predating established religions. Scholars who studied them argued that they were warnings. Others believed they were part of a psychological tactic designed to weaken invaders long before arrows flew. Yet a small group of researchers suggested something more radical, proposing that the Huntress was invoking forgotten rites connected to nature itself, blending spiritual intimidation with tactical brilliance. As the bodies were transported back to fortified towns, fear spread faster than plague. Rumors circulated that the Huntress could predict movements before they happened, that she traveled through forests with impossible speed, that she knew the weaknesses of every army that entered her territory. None of this was confirmed, yet none of it could be disproven either. Kings began questioning their scouts. Were enemy spies feeding information to her network? Were rebel groups aiding her? Or had they underestimated the power of someone trained in methods Europe had chosen to forget? What became undeniable was that she understood warfare not as a contest of strength, but as a contest of perception. She attacked the mind first. She dismantled confidence. She turned terrain into a weapon and fear into an ally. And as the chronicles began to acknowledge this pattern, one truth grew increasingly impossible to ignore. The Huntress was preparing for something larger, something far beyond revenge or mere survival. The second massacre was not an ending. It was a message. And the rulers who received it were left wondering whether they were witnessing the rise of a new kind of enemy or the return of an ancient one. By the time the third campaign approached her borders, the invaders were no longer just wary. They were paralyzed with anticipation. Word had spread that no ordinary force could withstand the Shadow Huntress, and fear had begun to infect entire units before they even crossed the first river. Commanders reported strange phenomena: scouts vanishing without trace, horses found grazing miles away from encampments, and sentries hearing whispers that seemed to come from the very trees. These were no hallucinations. They were meticulously crafted strategies, a fusion of instinct, intelligence, and an almost supernatural awareness of human psychology. The Huntress did not rely solely on brute force. She orchestrated environments to manipulate perception. Forest paths were reshaped overnight. Stagnant streams became channels for sound, carrying whispers that seemed to float from nowhere. Fires were lit strategically to cast shadows that made enemy soldiers overestimate her numbers. She studied their rotations, their meal schedules, even the smallest patterns of their rest. Each move they made was anticipated and countered with silent precision. And when the moment came to strike, it was not with overwhelming numbers, but with sudden disorienting strikes that shattered morale faster than any blade. One notorious encounter involved a unit of elite knights, renowned across several kingdoms for their discipline. They were sent to secure a valley, rumored to harbor one of her encampments. As they entered, fog rolled in unnaturally thick, masking their movements. Sounds of distant horns echoed from multiple directions, though no horns were present. When the fog lifted, half the unit was missing, and those who remained spoke of invisible hands guiding traps, vines pulling men into pits, and arrows that seemed to fly from impossible angles. Psychological collapse set in before a single direct confrontation occurred. The Huntress had mastered the art of preemptive terror, breaking cohesion long before battle lines met. What made her truly unpredictable was her combination of stealth and theatrics. Evidence suggests that she occasionally staged controlled escapes or left bodies deliberately exposed, arranged in grotesque patterns meant to communicate a message to the next wave of invaders. Soldiers spoke of arrows lodged in the ground forming symbols, of corpses positioned as if bowing to an invisible queen, sending a narrative of dominance that no herald or envoy could match. The impact was both tactical and cultural. Fear became part of the legend became strategy, and strategy became a weapon as powerful as steel. At night, the camps were haunted by faint footsteps, barely audible, yet impossible to ignore. Food stores were sabotaged subtly, water tainted with natural compounds that caused hallucinations, and sentries often fell into deep slumber despite vigilance. By the time dawn arrived, units were scattered, frenzied, and exhausted, often turning on each other in confusion. The Huntress herself would appear at the periphery, sometimes visible, sometimes only suggested by movement in the corner of the eye, reinforcing the impression of omnipresence. Her mastery of psychological warfare reshaped how Europe understood the limits of conventional military engagement. It was no longer enough to muster forces, train knights, and stock weapons. Any campaign against her required understanding the invisible battlefield, the terrain of fear, anticipation, and perception she commanded with relentless expertise. And as intelligence trickled into the courts of kings, a chilling realization spread. Victory was never guaranteed, and defeat could arrive before a single sword was drawn, orchestrated by a woman whose existence seemed to defy every rule they had been taught. By the time the invaders dared to penetrate her territory a third time, whispers of the Shadow Huntresses' rights had already reached distant courts. Nobles spoke of forbidden rituals that granted her uncanny foresight, rituals that intertwined superstition and meticulous strategy. She didn't simply rely on traps or ambushes. She cultivated the land itself as a weapon, using ancient rites that had been suppressed by religious authorities for centuries. Trees were planted in precise alignments, streams redirected subtly to alter sound, and patterns in the soil acted as markers known only to her and her clandestine network. What outsiders saw as forest, she saw as chessboard. Her preparation was as much psychological as physical. She would lure scouts into false clearings, leaving signs of prior skirmishes that never occurred. The invaders, believing themselves to be clever, would follow these false trails and fall into zones where shadows moved like living entities. At night, flickers of light, candles hidden beneath foliage, created illusions of spectral guardians. Soldiers, already unnerved by previous encounters, reported seeing silhouettes of a woman moving impossibly fast, vanishing before any arrow could reach her. The Huntress was no mere human. She was the embodiment of fear itself. One of her most chilling tactics involved survivors from prior attacks. Prisoners were returned, not to be tortured, but to carry stories deliberately crafted to confuse, demoralize, and spread her legend. Soldiers who witnessed her methods spoke of messages carved into bark or rocks, cryptic symbols warning of certain death, invoking a sense of inevitability that paralyzed even seasoned captains. These acts blurred the line between reality and myth, creating a psychological battlefield where each footstep was uncertain and every shadow a potential killer. Then came the ritual that truly defined her terror. Accounts suggest she drew upon ancient knowledge lost to kings and monks alike, performing ceremonies in hidden clearings at precise celestial alignments. Herbs, chants, and symbols worked together to disorient invaders and heighten the natural fear embedded in human instinct. Knights who encountered her afterward described a sensation of time bending, of sounds that did not belong to the world, and of dread so tangible it pressed on their chests. Her enemies began to hesitate, arguing among themselves, their unity unraveling without a single strike exchanged. The most striking consequence of these rites was the ripple effect across Europe. Kings learned not only to fear her, but to question the reliability of their intelligence, the courage of their captains, and even the loyalty of their own soldiers. They could not calculate her movements, predict her strikes, or fully comprehend her methods. Reports to courts arrived in fragments, filled with confusion and terror, but one recurring message persisted. She was everywhere and nowhere, her influence spreading like a shadow over every strategic decision. At this point, the magnitude of her power became undeniable. Europe's rulers could debate tactics endlessly, but each failed attempt reinforced the legend. And here is where you come in. I want you to imagine being a soldier caught in one of these traps, knowing a master of psychological warfare shapes every step you take. How would you survive? Could you retain your mind when the terrain itself seems alive against you? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. What would you do if you faced someone like the Shadow Huntress? How would you confront fear that moves before you even realize it's there? Share your perspective, because understanding her strategies is the key to grasping the full scale of her legend. While her presence on the battlefield was terrifying enough, the Shadow Huntress understood that true power extended far beyond direct confrontation. She waged silent wars, infiltrating rival kingdoms through spies, clandestine alliances, and networks that no army could detect. Merchants carried coded messages in their wares, traveling between courts with no one suspecting that secrets of life and death were hidden among fabrics and pottery. Nobles who thought themselves untouchable were subtly influenced, their decisions manipulated by whispers and rumors planted with surgical precision. Her reach extended into councils where kings debated military strategies. Reports arrived that seemed mundane, yet they contained subtle falsehoods engineered to provoke mistrust and miscalculation. A general might be ordered to march east when a decisive strike was coming from the north. Supplies were rerouted, and alliances faltered because she had calculated the human tendencies toward greed, pride, and fear. These wars were waged without swords or catapults, yet the consequences were lethal. Entire regiments were rendered useless before they ever saw her face. What made her method extraordinary was her patience. She understood that terror alone could not sustain control. It had to be paired with psychological conditioning. Envoys captured during minor skirmishes were returned with carefully crafted tales, exaggerating the Huntress's omnipresence, the precision of her traps, and the fate of anyone who dared resist. Word of her actions spread faster than any written decree. It created hesitation, doubt, and ultimately paralysis among commanders who had faced numerous foes yet never anything like this. One notable account describes a border fortress where a king's most trusted advisors convened to strategize. Each night, Strange sounds echoed along the walls. Footsteps that moved against the wind, shadows that darted across towers where no sentries stood. Soldiers reported glimpses of a figure, pale, agile, and uncatchable. By dawn, the fortress commander realized that his men's morale had crumbled overnight, their confidence shattered before the enemy had even breached the gate. That was her design: strike invisibly, dominate psychologically, then let the natural fear she instilled complete the destruction. She also employed deception as a core tactic. Rumors of phantom attacks were orchestrated so meticulously that entire armies abandoned camps, believing they had been ambushed, only to find the battlefield empty except for broken banners and scattered supplies. Leaders began to question not only their enemies' movements, but their own judgments. Every decision became a gamble, every step a potential trap. It was as if she had rewritten the rules of warfare itself, merging strategy, psychology, and ritual into a seamless system that no traditional army could comprehend. Through these silent wars, she achieved something remarkable. Kingdoms began to alter their policies and troop deployments based on fear of her, even without a single direct engagement. The Huntress had weaponized perception, making imagination and rumor as dangerous as swords and arrows. Her enemies became prisoners of possibility, anticipating threats that might never materialize, yet reacting as if they were inevitable. And in doing so, she reshaped the balance of power, proving that in a world governed by brute force, subtlety, intellect, and fear, could command entire nations as effectively as any army. The night she chose to strike next would be remembered for centuries, though no chronicle from that time fully captured it. An invading army, several thousand strong, had established a camp along a narrow valley. They believed themselves prepared, confident, in their numbers and the strength of their fortifications. But the Shadow Huntress had studied every detail. She knew the terrain, the rotation of guards, and even the personal routines of each officer. By the time darkness fell, she had already set the stage for a spectacle of calculated terror. Her forces moved silently, almost imperceptibly, weaving through the camp like shadows given form. Fires were extinguished in moments, tents rearranged to create confusion, and the men's own tracks were erased or misdirected. The soldiers awoke to an eerie stillness, a fog rising unnaturally thick, muffling every sound and hiding every movement. By the time they realized something was amiss, she had already struck. Arrows flew from unseen positions, supply wagons burned along narrow paths, and sentries disappeared without a trace. Panic erupted before a single engagement could take place. Chaos multiplied exponentially. Officers attempted to regroup, shouting orders that were lost in the mist. Soldiers stumbled into traps so cunningly laid that they did not understand what had happened until it was too late. Bridges were sabotaged subtly, forcing detachments into treacherous terrain, while false sounds of engagement drew entire units away from one another. Within hours, a disciplined army was reduced to fragmented groups, wandering aimlessly, exhausted, and terrified. They were alive, yet rendered powerless, victims of a strategy that relied on anticipation, manipulation, and psychological dominance rather than brute force. What made this operation extraordinary was its efficiency. Not a single permanent casualty occurred initially. She preserved the invaders to witness their own disorientation. They became instruments of their own fear, haunted by imagined enemies and whispered warnings carried by her scouts. Survivors later described movements and figures in the darkness that seemed to defy physical possibility. A woman appearing and disappearing in moments, guiding the panic, shaping the battlefield from the shadows. By the time dawn approached, only small fragments of the original force remained, scattered across the valley, unable to assemble or communicate effectively. When news reached neighboring kingdoms, whispers of her power had already begun to travel. The story was told in fragments, often exaggerated, but the core truth remained. A single figure had dismantled an entire army without direct confrontation, using nothing but strategy, fear, and unmatched precision. Kings were forced to reconsider conventional warfare. Commanders questioned the reliability of scouts, the loyalty of their troops, and the very meaning of preparation. For the first time, rulers understood that the Huntress's battlefield extended far beyond the visible. It was a landscape of perception, imagination, and terror, where any misstep could be fatal even without a sword being drawn. Her legend grew not from victories alone, but from the psychological imprint she left behind. Entire campaigns were delayed, alliances strained, and reinforcements diverted simply because commanders feared what they could not see. The Night of the Vanished Army became a cautionary tale whispered across Europe. An invisible adversary whose understanding of fear and manipulation surpassed every conventional measure of power. And as the chronicles gradually caught fragments of her campaigns, it became clear that the Shadow Huntress's true weapon was not steel, but the mind itself, bending reality to her will before her enemies even realized they were at war. By the time the Shadow Huntress's influence reached the courts of Europe, rumors of secret records and forbidden knowledge began to surface. Kings and advisors had attempted to erase any evidence of her campaigns, fearing that the full truth would inspire rebellion, fear, or doubt among their own soldiers. Yet fragments survived. Letters, coded reports, and sketches hidden in vaults, often misfiled or deliberately misinterpreted. These documents, pieced together by those who dared, revealed not just her tactics, but the meticulous system behind them. Every raid, every disappearance, every act of terror was part of an orchestrated plan that extended far beyond immediate battlefields. One account describes a scribe who stumbled upon instructions detailing the placement of sentries, the timing of ambushes, and even the psychological conditioning of captured soldiers. The Huntress had anticipated their reactions to every conceivable scenario, creating layers of deception that would make conventional strategies useless. Soldiers were not merely killed, they were used as instruments of confusion, planted in locations where their fear amplified her legend. Entire regiments were scattered without a single arrow fired, simply because they believed themselves trapped in a web they could not see. Her records also hinted at alliances with groups considered extinct or irrelevant by most rulers. Women trained in ancient rites, descendants of orders long erased by the church, acted as her eyes, messengers, and occasional enforcers. Their presence was subtle, yet every action contributed to the larger design. Even the smallest misstep by an invading commander could be anticipated and countered, resulting in strategic collapse before the first engagement. The Huntress's genius lay in the combination of tangible and intangible. Terrain, perception, superstition, and fear all merged into a single, unstoppable force. As kings learned of these records, anxiety spread faster than any army could march. Councils convened to interpret fragmented reports, debating whether the Shadow Huntress was a myth, a ghost, or a highly skilled operative. Some argued that she was orchestrating wars with supernatural foresight. Others insisted it was human cunning elevated to its most precise form. Either way, Europe's rulers could not ignore the lessons embedded in these hidden accounts. The meticulous details, the careful planning, and the psychological mastery revealed a level of control that no conventional general could match. Even when some records were destroyed, the remaining fragments created loops of fear. Each new army entering her territory assumed the worst, often abandoning campaigns preemptively. The Shadow Huntress had weaponized perception itself, transforming rumors into strategy, legends into psychological tools. Her influence became an unseen battlefield where every step, every choice, every hesitation was anticipated, exploited, and magnified into decisive outcomes. Now imagine you are a commander reading these accounts for the first time. realizing that every calculation you've relied on for decades might be useless. How would you prepare against someone whose strength lies not in armies, but in shadows, whispers, and the mind? Think about that as you leave a comment below. What would you do if confronted with an enemy who manipulates reality itself? Share your thoughts, because understanding her methods is essential to grasping the scale of her mastery. Constant vigilance, calculated strikes, and psychological manipulation left traces not only in her enemies, but also in herself. Hidden accounts describe nights spent in solitary meditation, wounds tended in secret, and the emotional scars of those she spared but used as instruments of fear. Each calculated raid, each ambush, each vanishing army added to a growing burden, a blend of exhaustion, paranoia, and the solitude that accompanies absolute mastery. Her body, often moving faster and further than any ordinary soldier, began to show signs of relentless strain. Sprains, cuts, and the constant tension of readying her senses to detect every sound, shadow, and movement wore down even her remarkable physical resilience. Chroniclers later noted that she sometimes disappeared for days, not to rest or heal in the open, but to traverse uncharted forests and mountains, training both body and mind for the next encounter. Even allies whispered that she aged unevenly, a woman whose presence seemed ageless, yet whose eyes betrayed the cost of endless vigilance. But the true toll was psychological. She carried the memories of every soldier terrified, every camp disrupted, every death carefully orchestrated to maximize effect. Even those who survived her attacks often left behind echoes in her mind, their fear like whispers that persisted long after their departure. Diaries, recovered centuries later, hint at nightmares filled with impossible geometry, maps that rearranged themselves in darkness, shadows that stalked her own movements, the ever-present sense that any miscalculation could unravel her carefully maintained dominion. Her genius in manipulating perception cut both ways, forcing her to inhabit a world where reality and illusion were inseparable. Her closest allies, women trained in the same forbidden arts, noted that the Huntress sometimes faltered. Briefly, in moments when human emotion threatened to interfere with tactical brilliance. She would isolate herself, performing rituals to regain composure, centering her mind while the world beyond her forests descended into chaos because of her influence. Even her carefully concealed emotions, subtle as shadows, were woven into the theater of warfare. Soldiers often misjudged her mood, a calculated unpredictability designed to amplify fear. Yet it came at a cost, sustaining the ruse required, near-constant self-discipline and the suppression of natural instincts. Despite the immense strain, she adapted. Pain, fatigue, and loneliness became tools, shaping her focus and sharpening her instincts. She learned to harness the adrenaline of fear, both her own and that of her enemies, as a source of clarity rather than weakness. Her body moved with preternatural precision, each step calculated to conserve energy and maximize efficiency, while her mind orchestrated layers of strategy invisible to anyone but her. This dual mastery of self and environment rendered her unstoppable, yet it exacted a hidden toll, invisible to the kings and generals who feared her. And as Europe's armies reconsidered their strategies and her name spread in fearful whispers, it became evident that her legend was not only defined by victories or massacres, but by the sacrifices she bore alone. The Huntress's greatest weapon was her mind, honed by relentless practice, endurance, and the intimate acquaintance with fear, both given and received. Every successful campaign left her stronger in skill, yet deeper in solitude, preparing her for the climactic confrontations yet to come, where strategy, terror, and personal cost would converge in ways no chronicler could fully capture. By the time the Shadow Huntress faced her ultimate adversaries, she had transformed the very concept of warfare. Entire armies had fallen not to superior numbers or brute force, but to a strategy rooted in precision, anticipation, and the artful orchestration of fear. Reports suggest that the final confrontation occurred in a rugged, mountainous region where terrain itself became an ally. Narrow passes, hidden ravines, and treacherous slopes were deliberately utilized to fragment and disorient forces before they could even form ranks. The invaders arrived confident, armed with intelligence that underestimated her reach and overestimated their own strength. They were met not by direct engagement, but by a series of calculated diversions, false camps, decoy movements, and shadows that seemed to move independently of any visible force. Soldiers reported a persistent sense of being watched, tracked, and anticipated. Every attempt to advance was met with an invisible resistance, traps sprung silently, and terrain manipulated subtly to force exhaustion and confusion. By the time they realized the scope of her preparation, disorder had already taken root. In the midst of this chaos, the Huntress herself appeared at critical junctures, a figure of near-mythic presence. Arrows struck precisely from unseen positions. Signals and sounds manipulated perception to make her army appear larger and omnipresent. Officers attempted to coordinate counterattacks, but the more they engaged, the more they became ensnared in her psychological design. Supply lines vanished, units became isolated, and morale deteriorated faster than any physical casualties could account for. The battlefield was no longer a physical space. It had become a landscape of fear, where imagination and anticipation dictated outcomes. An unexpected twist came when a contingent believed they had captured one of her lieutenants, only to discover it was a decoy, trained to mislead and redirect their efforts. This diversion allowed the Huntress to strike at the enemy's most vulnerable point, demonstrating an understanding of both human nature and battlefield dynamics that exceeded conventional military theory. Witnesses described moments where entire companies hesitated, unsure whether an attack was imminent, whether shadows were soldiers or illusion, and whether retreat was wiser than engagement. Hesitation, she had learned, could be weaponized as effectively as blades and bows. The culmination of this final confrontation did not involve a single decisive battle, but a series of maneuvers so precise that the invading force unraveled entirely. Leaders were separated from their men, messages intercepted or falsified, and fear amplified by carefully orchestrated whispers, sightings, and symbolic acts that hinted at omnipresence. By the end, what remained of the army was scattered, demoralized, and convinced that they had faced an enemy capable of bending reality itself. The Huntress's reputation as a master of psychological and strategic warfare was cemented, not through sheer numbers, but through an artistry of manipulation, anticipation, and relentless innovation. And as the surrounding kingdoms caught wind of the outcome, Europe's rulers began to reconsider the very nature of power and control. They realized that their armies, no matter how vast, could be neutralized by a combination of intelligence, patience, and fear, wielded with surgical precision. The Shadow Huntress had achieved what few could imagine. She had redefined warfare itself, not by conquest alone, but by turning perception, belief, and terror into the ultimate instruments of dominion. As the Shadow Huntress's campaigns receded into history, her methods did not vanish with her presence. Instead, they left a legacy embedded in secret military practices, whispered knowledge, and the psychological blueprints of warfare that would influence generations. Chronicles, often censored or fragmented, describe how her techniques were studied discreetly by scholars, commanders, and shadowy advisors who recognized the unprecedented mastery of perception, fear, and anticipation she wielded. She had transformed the battlefield from a physical arena into a landscape of strategy where understanding human nature was as critical as swordsmanship or archery. Her influence extended far beyond any single engagement. Survivors of her encounters carried tales that evolved into practical lessons, teaching others how to manipulate terrain, perception, and morale. Secret societies and clandestine groups incorporated her insights into training exercises, using fear, ritual, and psychological conditioning to prepare soldiers for unpredictable threats. Entire doctrines were built on the principle that control over perception often outweighed numerical superiority. The Huntress had shown that victory was achieved not solely through force, but through the orchestration of reality itself, bending belief and expectation as weapons. Yet her story also carried a cautionary undertone. The same strategies that dismantled invaders required discipline, insight, and emotional resilience. Without precision, the techniques could backfire, turning manipulation into chaos and fear into disarray. Records indicate that only a few ever achieved mastery comparable to hers, and those who attempted it without understanding often succumbed to the very psychological pressures they sought to exploit. Her legacy was thus double-edged, a source of unmatched strategic knowledge, and a warning of the personal and moral toll exacted by total control. As Europe adjusted to her absence, kingdoms adapted both defensively and offensively, aware that an unseen adversary could strike with devastating efficiency. The psychological frameworks she employed became embedded subtly into military thought, influencing strategies across borders and centuries. Observers who pieced together her campaigns understood that her genius lay not merely in ambushes or physical tactics, but in orchestrating entire systems of fear, misinformation, and anticipation. She had engineered conflict on a level that transcended the battlefield, shaping decisions, alliances, and morale without ever being fully seen. Now, having journeyed through her life, her campaigns, and her influence, it's clear that the Shadow Huntress was more than a historical figure. She was a master of strategy, perception, and the human mind. If this narrative has challenged your understanding of history, of power, or of fear, take a moment to engage. Leave a comment with a phrase like, "I followed her shadow," or "This story spoke to me," because sharing your reflection helps connect the past with your perception today. Make sure you like this video, check that you're subscribed, and prepare to explore more of these hidden stories that shape history in ways often unseen. And if you're ready for what comes next, there's another story waiting that continues this journey into the shadows of forgotten power, revealing tactics and secrets that shaped empires beyond recognition.